It was a happy life. I think people back then, they had to have their own entertainment.
They were more dependent upon each other in those days. You didn't have the equipment, so you used the manpower.
And of course, you raise your own vegetables a lot. You raise your own meat, raise all the things that you really have to have for food.
Maybe 3 trips a year, 3 or 4 trips a year to the store.
Well, it was always horse and buggy, pretty much. That's all it was.
Most farmers would give a little piece of land just big enough to build a schoolhouse on.
The early inhabitants of Lamoille County had inspiring stories of how they lived off their land. Their ruggedness, self-reliance, and cooperative spirit are values still shared by the residents of the county to this day.
Lamoille County, the youngest of Vermont's 14 counties, was established by the legislature in 1835. Straddling the Green Mountains, its location was chosen as a way for the legislature to divide the power between the eastern and western parts of the state.
Lamoille County was created by taking 12 existing towns from neighboring counties.
Due to their remote location, 2 of the original towns, Mansfield and Sterling, were incorporated into their neighbors by 1855.
The town only existed 50 years. The original grantees that received land, there were 63 of them altogether, and they were given the land grants for Revolutionary War service. That was their payment. Not very many of them, if any, ever settled in town. They never had a center. So there was pockets of settlement. And one pocket was in Johnson, one pocket Morristown, one pocket Cambridge, and one pocket in Stowe. There was no access to anything. They had to climb over the mountains with no paths. They'd have to mark their trees to find their way to record the birth of their child, or to find a justice of the peace to get married, or to vote, or whatever. They were just totally helpless. The first town meeting was in March of 1806. There were only 10 heads of households, so that gives you an idea of what it started out to be. By the time it was disenfranchised, there were 233, which was, I guess for Sterling, that was a good amount of people, figuring a lot of years there were not more than 50 to, say, 120, 125.
Sterling never had a general store or a post office or anything like that. And after the lumber business started petering out, of course, people moved out of Sterling. And then they annexed Sterling to Stowe and Cambridge and Johnson.
Mansfield was all mountain. There was very little of the town of Mansfield that actually laid down in the valley. A little bit right around where Top Notch stands now. But that was about the only bit of Mansfield that was flat. Ivory Luce was my great-great-great-grandfather. He came here from Heartland, Vermont, and settled in the town of Mansfield. His uncle had settled the town of Stowe. Ivory arrived here several years after Stowe was settled, tried to eke out a living of a farm. He owned almost all of what is now Mansfield. Absolutely worthless property. It was not farmable. No timber could be cut off from it. Sold it and broke it up in lots and sold it for a half-cent an acre, which was the taxes. The town of Mansfield, when it existed, there is no listing of any type of industry other than farming. Since there wasn't easy transportation, that was a big part of the big downfall.
When Mansfield went out, which only ended up having probably 8 or 10 people living in the whole township, 6 mile square township, they annexed part of it to Underhill and Stowe and Cambridge.
From the very, very earliest settling of all of these towns, the mills were almost the most important thing in the town. And a lot of the stories you'll read about the early settlers, if they didn't have a mill, they might have to carry a bushel of wheat or corn or something 15 or 16 miles to get to the closest mill. And that's the reason why a lot of our villages in one town and another are located so close to the rivers, because we had to use They had to use the river's power to run the sawmills and the grist mill.
Back years ago, it was all farming community.
Neighborhoods were closer. People interacted more. They were more dependent upon each other in those days. You didn't have the equipment, so you used the manpower.
It was a hard life, you know. Everything was done with horse and wagon. They didn't have tractors or anything. It was all done with, you cut your hay with horses and you gathered it with horses.
In my early teen years, there were a number of farms right in our own neighborhood. Whenever harvest time came, there was farmers that formed work gangs to do the harvest, particularly for corn and stuff like that. There would be one in the neighborhood that would have the equipment to cut and fill silos with, and the rest of them provided the labor to get it done. So they worked on most of the farms in the area as laborers in order to get the equipment to their own farm when their turn came. My dad was a farmer all of his life. He worked with cows and as a farm laborer and worked in the woods logging. That was a wintertime occupation for most of us Vermont farmers a generation or two ago. Mother Nature timed the cows' calving intervals to calve in the spring, and they milked well on the grass. And come wintertime, you weren't getting very much milk, so the income was brought in from logging. And a lot of the logging was done in areas that weren't accessible in the summer times.
Yeah, you had to have 2 full-time jobs, I felt, to balance out your farming. But it was a good thing to do.
The ones who weren't farming full-time, were employed, the bigger part of them were employed at the asbestos mines. And some of the ones who were farming also worked at the asbestos mines and farmed part-time, you know.
There used to be a lot of people from Morrisville, from Hyde Park, from Johnson, from Westmore, north of Lowell, from Lowell, a lot that worked in the mine. I got $16 a week, $16.20 a week in the mine. I took a job in the back because it paid me a lot more. They paid me $18 a week.
In 1940, when they first started the chairlift, of course, a lot of people worked up on the mountain building the chairlift, a lot of the local people. Actually, during the wintertime, if you wanted to work, that's where you worked, was on the mountain, because they needed people to run the lifts, unload and unload, and cut the trails and pack the trails, and they had shovelers that used to go up and down the trails and smooth out the bumps. And there was most of the local people, if they worked, if they didn't work in a store or didn't work in a restaurant, they worked on the mountain. It was pretty much the only work there was during the winter.
Of course, you had sugaring, had a lot of sugar makers. All these things helped.
When I was little, a typical farm had probably 15 to 20 cows.
And herds were mortgaged. I've seen a deed from my great uncles where he mortgaged 15 cows when he got married to buy a house full of furniture.
15 to 20 cows is a big number. And of course, all the milking at that point in time was done by hand.
Everybody had the Jersey cow, and they separated the milk and carried the cream down and sold it. That's why I guess the companies were called creameries in those days, because they didn't deal with whole milk. About the time I was born, milk was marketed as milk. And when I was 16, my father was hired by the Hood's Milk Company to haul milk into the plant in Hardwick. And some individuals trucked their own milk in cans. So it was all done in 10-gallon cans.
We had a milk route when we first came to Vermont. At one time when we first started, there was something like 28 or 29 farms that we bought in just from Pleasant Valley.
The milk came to either Hyde Park or Morrisville. From Morrisville it was loaded and trucked to Boston.
So you cooled the milk down with spring water as cold as you could get it. Then you put it in a cooler so it wouldn't spoil overnight, and then it went to the creamery the next morning with your morning's milk. The morning's milk could go warm because they would process it fast, but the night's milk needed a cooler. And we didn't have electricity, so that's how you did it. And you cut the ice on the mill pond and you transport it with your horses in blocks way up to the farm. And then you stacked them tight together and you covered them with sawdust from the mills all over. This big house is just a shell on the outside, and the walls frequently were filled with sawdust to insulate against warmth, and it kept the cool in.
Farm I was raised on, we had an ice house, and we cut ice, filled the ice house, covered it with sawdust to keep it, and in the next August, if my mother would say to me, you go out and get a cake of ice, and I'll make some ice cream, and you get the ice cream freezer, and we'll make some ice cream. Now, I was a teenage boy. My dad would say, you're barefoot, and you get up on the ice house, and you tread down that sawdust. So that it would be all over, because it would thaw a little around the edges. Now, those blocks of ice, I know because I cut ice. And I cut it and sold it during the Depression years. It was 16 inches square and maybe almost 2 feet thick. If you were enterprising, you couldn't find a job, you could stake yourself a claim on the mill pond and cut ice with an ice saw and sell the cakes for 2 cents apiece. And the farmers would come and get them because every farmer had an ice house.
There were a lot of big ice houses that furnished the public in town with ice box like coolers. And the blocks were delivered around town by people. And they were kept in ice houses just like we did to keep our milk cool. And they bring a block of ice around and put it on the top of your refrigerator. And it was a delivery thing just like milk was delivered house to house.
My great uncle, he'd been taking the milk to the creamery in the village, and he picked the milk up from the other farmers along the way. Well, he had a couple of his own children who were in high school age, so he started transporting them to high school, and other kids came old enough to go, so he would pick them up. So he ended up operating a milk truck school bus / delivery wagon, because he'd pick up anything you needed in the village and bring it back with him. That operated for many years until he slipped in the snow one time and went into the ditch, and the milk all spilled in among the kids, and these milk cans crashing around in the back. Nobody was hurt, but the school board decided he really shouldn't be carrying milk and kids in the same load.
We walked to school. Everybody walked to school. If somebody lived back on the hills, their parents brought them down if they didn't walk. I asked my son, he's 57 years old, if he remembers ever riding to school. He went to school up here in the village. He said no, he walked always. So that was 50 years ago. He walked to school.
I would have been 8 years old when I started the first grade because we lived 3.5 miles from school. And the roads weren't plowed in the winter, and of course they didn't have school buses back then. And I was limited in my ability to forage through the snow.
They didn't have any school transportation. You furnished your own. I walked the 2 miles up from the Thompsons, and occasionally I could catch a ride on the back of Henry Manchester's buggy. He had a horse and buggy and 2 sisters, and if they came along when I was walking, I could climb on the back end of the buggy instead.
I rode horseback to school, my brother and I. We had a pair of spotted ponies. My father used to leave the grain for the horses at the place. And of course the horses knew they were going to get grain just as soon as they got there. So they traveled right along.
Schools were built where there was a population of children. Story of one that's built up in Stowe Hollow, the guy had 11 children, so he gave the land to have the school built on right next to his house so that his kids wouldn't have to go far to get to school.
And my first job was at the Smiley School in Cambridge down the road. And we had a big old wood furnace with a jacket around it so the children wouldn't get burned. And one of the older boys always built the fire and kept it going during the day. We had water in a jug. It was a water jug with a spigot on it. And the children had their cups, paper cups we had, so they could get their drinks. For lunches, they brought their lunch. But in the wintertime, I used to take a kettle and a hot plate and some soup, and I'd make soup for them so they'd have something hot.
The school, an 8th grade school, if there were students for all 8 grades, I made the 12th student in the school. And it was quite something to be the only member of the 3rd grade.
There were 6 students in that school the first year I started school. There were 6 students, grades 1 through 8.
In the one-room schoolhouse, there was one teacher, and she would group upper grades, lower grades. Of course, the initial 1st graders would be by themselves to learn to read and do their stuff, but the middle grades and the upper grades were grouped together for certain subjects. As you went through 8 grades worth of school, you would hear a lot of the same stuff over each year. So when it came your turn to have it, you had already heard it so many times that you were preconditioned for it.
It was 12 or 13 children there in the school, and the parents all got together and cut the wood to heat the school.
Everybody kind of had a job to do, and it was all sort of a team effort. The teacher saw to it that everybody did what they were supposed to do.
When I was 10 years old, I inherited the job of going there early in the morning and starting the fire in the box stove to warm the schoolhouse up. And it was a small one-room schoolhouse. So I would leave about 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning and get to school and build a roaring fire in that box stove, in that big box stove, and try to get that. And there was a lot of days in the winter, a tremendous amount of time in the winter when you didn't take your coat off all day in that schoolhouse. It wasn't insulated, and in order to survive there, you kept your coat on, and a lot of classes were conducted right around that box stove.
The only time we took our gloves off in the building was when we were in typing class, because it was hard to type with gloves on. And that was with the heat going full blast.
I think people back then, they didn't have things like television, things like that. They had to have their own entertainment.
Socials, they would get together for birthday parties, anniversary parties, and if it wasn't at the home, it would be in the schoolhouse, which became the center of the neighborhood.
Kitchen tunks or kitchen tunkets in the evening in the winter. They'd clear out the kitchen, clear all the furniture out of the kitchen, and they'd get a fiddle player, and 3 or 4 families would get together, and they would sing and dance.
The old home days, I think, were started by the community club, which was organized here in town. It usually involved a whole day's activities, started with a parade. Way back, Waterville had their own band. Then they had games of some kind. Might be horseshoes, it might be a cross-cut saw contest. 2 men, see how fast they could saw a log in 2. And at noon, the ladies served a full dinner.
I've heard tell, or I've read in some diaries of relatives where they'd walk to the village, which from Nebraska Valley was a distance of 5 miles. They'd walk into the village in the evening to watch the young boys racing their horses on Main Street, and then walk home afterwards.
I think it was sort of isolated, especially in the wintertime. But you know, young people had fun. The mill pond, there was a mill up here, sawmill, and there was a pond because of the dam. And they'd go up there, we'd go up there and shovel it off and skate.
When I got to be a junior or a senior, I had to come to town every night, walk 2 miles, and that was entertainment.
We used to go sliding down on the hill that goes up to by Roger Wynn's there, and we'd go every night after school. My family and my brother and sisters, and the neighbors, and we'd lay down on the sled. You know, we had a wooden sled, and my hip bone stuck out the end, and my stomach got black and blue, and I used to put padding on it, you know. But we were bound to go every night.
Sliding was good. You could slide in the road. There was no traffic here, no sand on the road, so sleds worked really well. And we even did that at school. We or play fox and geese. Our games that we played were quite often something that we learned at school and did at school because we didn't have exposure to a group of people large enough to play many games, except for your own brothers and sisters, and quite often that wasn't done.
Back when I was younger, the only place they really had any entertainment was they used to run movies over here at the Soldiers Memorial every Saturday night.
All through high school, I could go to the movies for 35 cents at the Bijou. The movie operator had a film, and he turned the crank that ran the film through.
Otherwise, we played baseball and did different games. And we used to have a good time in the winter down here when it first started. The old cars that used to have these bumpers, and they used to be springs. There used to be a little bit of chrome springs on each side. And the boys, a bunch of boys in town, me included, pretty dumb, we used to wait down here at 108 when a car would come off the mountain road. We'd run out and grab onto that spring and squat down, and they'd drag us all the way up Maple Street until we thought we was going too fast, and then we'd let go, and then we'd turn around, go back down, and hook another ride. There's probably 8 or 10 boys in town that used to do that. That was a late night entertainment that we used to have.
Once a year, there would be a fair out here at the Lamoille Valley Fairgrounds.
And Elmore, Hyde Park, Johnson, Wolcott, they'd all congregate and go to that one fair. The whole family would get together and put up a picnic lunch, and they had cars back then, back in the late 30s and 40s. Pretty much right where Hannaford's and that area is, they used to have a racetrack where they used to race trotters and pacers. Teddy Roosevelt came through doing all his speeches to become president and everything. Quite an event. It was a pretty big fair. There's the backer, they'd stand up there and try to get you to come into different tents, so they could get your money. And
if you had cattle that were going to be judged in the fair or anything like that, it went to Morrisville.
I went one year. It was during the war. It was the last year they had the fair because they closed it because of the war effort, World War II.
More people got together at the fairs than any other single event during the year, and this was an important way for them to get their news. During the rest of the year, they got their news from a variety of other ways.
If you want to communicate before they had telephone lines, you just had to send somebody either walking or with a horse and buggy to go somewhere, Well, I was born up here in Stowe Hollow, and when my mother was going to have me, she had to send one of her sisters down to Doc Barrows down here to tell him that things were coming along, and I was about to be born, and he'd harness up his horse and get his buggy out and go all the way into the hollow. And lots of times he never got paid with cash. He got paid with potatoes or corn or vegetables or canned goods.
You didn't get the news like you get the news today. Back then, you might not hear it for quite some time. And local things that happen you hear because the families were close to each other.
We had a country store in the village, and it was a meeting, gathering place for the local gossip.
The big thing to get news back then was maybe going to the store on Saturday night. The store was always open on Saturday night, and people would take their baths and get all clean clothes and come to the store, do their shopping, and then they'd stand out on the steps and visit.
And if you were fortunate, there'd be a copy, the storekeeper generally had a copy of the News and Citizen, which was the paper at that time, and you could read what was happening, because a lot of people didn't have the, the 25 cents a week for the News and Citizen. They just didn't have that kind of money.
The Burlington Free Press came up every day. It used to come up by train, and then they had a truck that would bring the free presses to all the towns. They also mailed the free press out in the mail if you wanted to get it by mail.
We always had mail service.
The mail came by train, and when it went out, it went by train. It didn't stop to pick up the mail or drop it off, but it was once a day. There was someone who took the mail from the post office in a mail sack, and they put it up on a hook arrangement beside the railroad track, and the mail car would catch it with a hook on the car, and I guess the mail that was incoming mail was just thrown out onto the platform.
My grandfather and an uncle delivered mail with horses. They rigged up cars for the best parts of the season, but the winters and the mud seasons, they used their horses.
Well, the mailman stopped right at Eden's store. That's where the mail was delivered. And if you had any mail, you had to get out to the store to get it. There was no rural route. You had to get to the store to get it. And sometimes in the winter, where we lived, we were 3.5 miles from the store. Sometimes it went 2 or 3 weeks before we had any mail. If the weather was real bad, we didn't attempt to get out to the store. We stayed right at home. And then maybe 3 weeks later, we'd get out there and we'd have, 3 or 4 letters. The stage was the mail carrier who came from Hyde Park to Morrisville to Eden, or went up to Lowell. And then there'd be a mail carrier that went from Lowell to Newport. And people would be able to approach this mail carrier, and if they needed something in Morrisville, they might say, well, pick me up this item in Morrisville. One of the items they used to like to have picked up after Prohibition was a bottle of booze of some kind.
A lot of people had telephones.
It was the kind you had to turn a crank and you'd get the operator and you'd tell her what number you wanted and she'd connect it. And all the lines were party lines.
And you rang a different number for each person on that party line. Be 2 short and 1 long, or 1 long and 1 short, and different combinations of long and short signals that would come to your phone and it would ring. If it wasn't your signal, you weren't supposed to pick it up, but I think a lot of people did.
There was always 1 or 2 people that were always picking up and listening in, so you had to be a little careful about what you said on the telephone.
That's how gossip got started, I think. Yeah, there were some people that listened quite regularly. So generally you could make up pretty good stories and get them started. You heard news on the radio.
I can remember when the radios first came out. They had headsets. You couldn't ever listen, never a loudspeaker. They would take turns, they'd put the headset on, and you could listen a while, then you have to give the headset to somebody else so they could hear something.
You used to take the battery out of the car to run the radio so he could listen to Amos and Andy at night.
You always gathered around the family and listened to the one that Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy. Oh, you had to listen to Jack Armstrong in the evening. And then there was once or twice a week there was the Lone Ranger on there, you know. And of course, the early years during the war years, you stayed glued to the radio to hear the latest reports of the war.
Well, it was always horse and buggy, pretty much. That's all it was.
You went with a sleigh or a pung, what they referred to as a pung, which was a one-horse single sled. The roads were rolled.
It was a big wooden roller and horses hitched to it. And they would pack the snow down so that sleighs or sleds could get over it with horses. I've heard my husband tell about sometimes if they had a big storm and there'd be a huge drift somewhere, men would get together and go shovel that out so the roller could get through.
Because those drifts they didn't shovel them out. They became so hard, you know. They'd go down around them, through a pasture.
From 1925 to the 30s, of course, cars started coming around.
Most of the early cars were open touring cars with a demountable top. It would fold down.
The roads weren't all that great for them, but they were kind of limited like they do now. They didn't have any I-89, I'll tell you that. And the roads were pretty bad.
Well, transportation in the wintertime was something one did carefully. You always carried with you a shovel in the back of the car. You pretty much went where you had to go, and you'd drive until you come to the drift. And my dad would get out and shovel through the drift, and we'd drive along until we got to the next drift. Make your own road.
In the spring of the year, when the roads broke up, of course there was no gravel in the roads, and the automobiles that you had back then, if you tried to go anywhere in the spring, you could depend on being mired in the mud.
Route 100 was a plank road at one time, and they used to charge toll to go over it, but it got so expensive, they started putting in what they called the Mount Mansfield Electric Railroad. It was something that they talked about for a number of years, and they needed a way to transfer people and produce.
From Waterbury through Stowe to Hyde Park and connect with the train up there from the Lamoille Valley train tracks. They got the section built between Waterbury and Stowe, and that was as far as they got.
And everything came in on it, grain and dishes, clothes, linen, whatever you want to think you can think of, they transported. People used to ride it, from one place to another, and that's how they used to get to the trains to go to Boston or New York or wherever they wanted to go. That's how they used to get there, and it was all electric. It was a very prominent thing. Started in 1898, I think it was, and ran until 1932. When the cement road came in, it kind of made the electric railroad obsolete. And it was easier to go over the cement road than it was to take the train, and they could transport produce and stuff like that, with the trucks and cars and things.
The train really had a real place in our commerce in those days.
They thought at the time that the railroad was being built, the townspeople were hoping that it would come nearer Waterville and that it would help the businesses. They could get their goods out easily, but it didn't. Other people had more power and it went farther away. So I think that was part of the reason that so many of the businesses failed. That was a little hard for people who thought, if it came closer, it would help the town to grow. But I think that's probably why the town sort of gave up.
Well, everything came here like grain. Grain came in cars that you fed the cows, and Then fertilizer came and lime.
The station was usually located in the center of population.
If Stowe had anything to go to market, it either had to go to Morrisville to be put on the train or go to Waterbury to be put on the train.
I got just an example. My dad was a farmer, and he sold a lot of his produce. He would drive to the Hyde Park Railroad Station, and if you were there by 4 o'clock, you'd get the express train that came up through. That would go to St. Johnsbury, hit the Canadian National, which went down through the White River Junction, transferred, and that crate of eggs would be at Boston at 4 o'clock in the morning.
You raise your own meat and raise all the things that you really have to have for food. You could then, mostly.
They always had a cellar full of food. My mother, she'd bake 4 or 5 loaves of bread. We always had a big garden, and she would can, I hesitate to say how many quarts of vegetables she would put up.
Well, this lady here that was 100 years old that lives here in town now, she used to tell me about how she used to put up 600 quarts of vegetables and different fruit and things, during the year so that they could have it during the winter and during the year.
At that point in time, we didn't have any electricity. Anything we wanted to keep cold, like milk, to keep it from souring, was put in a 2-quart jar with a string tied to the bale, and you lowered it down into the water tub, and it stayed in the water tub. But the beef had to be canned. My father would plan to butcher in the fall. He would butcher a pig, and sometimes a beef, or work for the neighbor who had a farm down the road and get a half a beef maybe for his work. And the pork was pickled and smoked and preserved in that manner. And then if he had a good summer and had been able to stay employed at the mines all summer, I'll occasionally buy a keg of tripe. He'd get a full keg of tripe.
Never went more than once a month to get the groceries because we raised everything. We raised our beef in our garden, and they had the hens, and they laid the eggs.
We existed 3.5 miles from the store, and a good amount of the people were further from the store than we were. We're out much farther from the store, and they, here again, did as we did, maybe 3 or 4 trips a year to the store. Just the smell, just the odor, just to go in and smell the store, that was worth a trip out there, We bought primarily flour. The flour was a staple, certainly flour, cornmeal, salt, sugar, although not too much sugar, because most of our sugar came from maples.
We had one general store, and we had a couple of others that were more or less grocery stores. The general store, where we met the buses and stuff, had almost anything you could, boots, shoes, clothes, harness parts, hardware. It was a true general store. They had we buy our groceries, meat, cheese, cookies, ice cream. They had a little of everything there.
The lifestyle was quite different back then.
The farms have changed a great deal in the last few years. Now the town of Olcott only got, I think, 2 or 3 dairy farms that are operating.
At one point in time, I think there was 26 operating dairy farms in the town of Eden. And today there's just, to my knowledge, just 1 farm that's operating.
I think families were closer, and they give their time and effort, but they did it because they loved it.
Well, everybody was equal, and you weren't competing with anyone, and your neighbors were neighbors, and I think that's good.
They didn't have much, but they didn't seem to mind, because everybody, was just probably in the same circumstance.
ever free.